Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you for responding. Okay, so welcome. My name is Whitney Battle-Baptiste. I am the director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center. It sounds very echoey in here because we've recently removed several, all of the walls were filled with file cabinets, and they were black. And black is beautiful, but when it's in file cabinets surrounding you, it feels a little. So we're so happy that we have an opened space, and we're going to continue to upgrade and have beautiful visuals. So we're very excited about that. So this is the first public talk of the semester at the Du Bois Center. And we're glad that you all are here in person. This is very exciting. And I want to say that a couple of weeks ago, we had a major loss in our community with the passing of John Bracey, Professor John Bracey, who had been at UMass Amherst since 1972. And I have no problem saying that that was a year after I was born. So he's been here a while. Yeah, I just told my age, it's fine. And he has served in various roles in the Du Bois department, including chair of the department a few times, and directing the graduate certificate in African Diaspora Studies. He was an expert on Black social history, racial ideologies and movements, and the history of African American women. He helped to create the Afro-American Studies Department and brought luminaries such as Betty Shabazz and James Baldwin to UMass. And I still remember stories of folks who were in, especially the class that James Baldwin taught, as he was sitting on the desk, smoking a few cigarettes after the other, and just talking about life. And that would be a great class. But John is also survived by his longtime partner and longtime University Without Walls leader, Ingrid Bracey. A tribute to his life is being planned for later on in the year when it's warmer. And the campus is currently fundraising for a graduate fellowship in his honor, and donations can be made via the link found on the College of Humanities and Fine Arts website. So just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the life and legacy of John Bracey, and also say that the Du Bois Center, where the room we're standing in right now, we would not be standing in if John Bracey didn't bring forth the command that this shall be the Du Bois Center. And so, because there was a lot of his stuff in here. So he had to move it out. That's why we got this great space. I promise I'm moving on to you. Okay. So, now for our featured speaker this evening. Kay Bailey Thomas is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Philosophy at Dartmouth College and an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Louisville. Sorry, I'm about to say Louisville. I'm sorry. I worked in Tennessee, so sorry, the pronunciation. They are also one of this year's W.E.B. Du Bois Center postdoctoral fellows. We are grateful to the State Street Corporation, whose generous philanthropic gift to the Du Bois Center funded Dr. Thomas's fellowship. During their residence at the Du Bois Center this past summer, Dr. Thomas conducted research on a long-term project focused on central arguments made by W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction. The project aims to address the importance of the seminal text through arguing for its relevancy in three areas: advancing current understandings of racial capital with regards to the afterlives of slavery in the United States, the need to resituate predominant understanding of Du Bois's critiques against Marxism and its application to race, and Du Bois's foreshadowing of a white supremacist ideology that has persisted into the current era. Outside of Dr. Thomas's work on Du Bois, they also research topics at the intersection of social epistemology and African American and Black studies, such as intellectual genealogies, radicalized knowledge, and ethics of care. Their research specializations are in African American and Black American philosophy, social epistemology, social and political philosophy, Black American feminist theory, and critical philosophy of race. And I want to say at the end of this that it is amazing the types of scholars that come together to talk about Du Bois and how so many disciplines can actually engage in Du Bois's work and bring Du Bois's work further. So without any more ado, please welcome Dr. K. Bailey Thomas.
Thank you, Whitney. So I'm just going to take 1 minute here to set a timer on my end so that you don't take up too much of everyone's time, so we can hopefully have a really engaging Q&A. So Adam, remind me, I just press the arrows and then it moves. Okay. So we're going to do a little balancing act here. We'll see how it goes. But you know, it's Black History Month. So
Yes.
we have all the Black magic that we need. Okay, so thank you again to Whitney for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Adam for helping organize everything around this, and thank you to you all for coming to hear about my research that I conducted over the summer and that's ongoing right now. So essentially, what this talk is going to be about is just a small portion of what's turning out to be 2 articles coming from my research that I did over the summer and then also back in 2019 when I was still a graduate student based on some archival research that I've been doing on Black Reconstruction. So with regards to this talk today, as you all probably have garnered if you read the abstract, I'm trying to illuminate the ways in which Black Reconstruction acts as a piece of African American intellectual history, primarily in the ways that it traces an intellectual genealogy of white supremacist logic. So the goal is to counter this idea, right, that Trumpism came out of nowhere after 2016 and even 2020 when we look at January 6th. This whitelash, as it's been termed, was viewed as something fantastical that no one could have predicted, would ever happen in this country. However, right, if we look at the African American intellectual tradition, none of this is new, right? This is repeated throughout time with various figures, even beyond Du Bois. We can look at this from various points within the radical Black tradition. So in terms of just the outline, there are sort of 3 main parts of this talk. So first, I'll just give a little bit of some background information around the project specifically, which also morphed into a separate project that I'm doing with Adam, an edited volume on Black Reconstruction. And I'll sort of walk you through 3 parts of what has become the second paper in this larger project on Black Reconstruction. And then finally, I want to conclude with some comments on the debacle around the AP African American Studies course. As some of you may have been following with College Board, DeSantis, and a whole slew of other people, including now Kimberly Crenshaw from the African American Public Policy Forum. Okay, so in terms of just a little bit of information around the research that I conducted over the summer, I came here primarily to just look in the archives. So I'm not a historian, but I am historically nosy. And being a philosopher, it's actually quite uncommon for us to use archival materials unless you work within the history of philosophy, and that's of course Kant, Hegel, Locke, so on and so forth, really just looking at maybe journals of theirs and doing some translation work. So actually coming to an archival site and engaging with an interdisciplinary scholar like Du Bois was quite extraordinary, but it also proposes some disciplinary challenges when it comes to how that work is going to be interpreted and understood. So as Whitney just mentioned, it's really great to see the ways in which Du Bois has touched many scholars, but it's not quite the case that every discipline that Du Bois has touched, welcomes him within that discipline. Philosophy is one of those very interesting gray areas. So in terms of the main argument within the larger project, what I want to emphasize is that there seems to be too much attention paid to the Marxist interpretation in Black Reconstruction. And by that, I want to say that many scholars, when they're examining this text, they're debating amongst themselves whether or not this Marxist analysis is accurate. And what I want to propose is that that's not quite the intention that Du Bois had when he set upon writing and constructing this book. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this text, Du Bois actually considered this, rather than Souls of Black Folk, as his magnum opus. He was researching and writing the content for this book for actually about 40 years. So even while he's writing Souls of Black Folk, there's evidence within the archives that he was gathering research around the role of African Americans in the Civil War. Now, of course, one primary obstruction in this task is that Du Bois is not permitted in many of the libraries in the South that would have these archival materials. So due to this, he has to engage in this long sort of letter chasing with many people, and he then ends up relying on some of the dissertations from the students who were called the Dunningites from the Dunning School of Reconstruction, in terms of looking at their dissertations and actually trying to analyze the empirical data that some of them were presenting as evidence for the so-called failure of Reconstruction. So with that being said, what I want to discuss within the project is really how can we understand this, this large volume as an attempt to not just correct a history or correct a dominant understanding of Reconstruction, but to really demonstrate the ways in which white supremacist logics and practices have so deeply been wedded within our everyday engagements in the United States that now when we have a AP history course about African American studies, it becomes so controversial that as of a couple of hours ago, Ron DeSantis has now declared that he is threatening to eliminate all AP studies courses if this course is not changed to his satisfaction. So one problem that folks often stumble upon when engaging with this book is that it is quite large, it's quite dense, and the arguments that Du Bois is developing are numerous and very, very intricate. So if you are not careful and you don't take the time to really go through this book, it's very easy to get lost. And I think that is one reason why folks tend to hang on to the Marxist argument, because it's probably the one that is most familiar, especially for those who were reading the text when it came out in 1935. A large portion of the criticism that Du Bois received and that he actually saved in a scrapbook is based on whether or not his interpretation of Marx was sound. So in the project, if we look at it as an intellectual history, rather than focusing on this Marxist analysis and its application, we can actually see that Du Bois is really creating a blueprint for how it is that the current white supremacist state was able to root itself in not just the public imaginary, but also within the everyday lives of American citizens. And he's going to trace this back to the period about 3 years before the Civil War, and then leading all the way to what's called the Redemption era. So that's just a little bit of background information in terms of what I was looking at with this project. And I'm going to move ahead. So in terms of some contextual information about Black Reconstruction as a whole that's going to be necessary to follow along with the rest of the talk. So first and foremost, the individual that Du Bois is responding to primarily in this text is this individual here, William A. Dunning. So he's considered, he's called the father of political science. He was also, I believe, one of the first presidents of the American Historical Association, very large and prominent figure in history and political science. And so when Dunning was in graduate school, he was under the study of someone named John Burgess. And Burgess argued that the study of history needs to be in the form of the scientific method. So with that, Dunning tried to essentially create a methodology wherein the study of history was something that was purely objective. There's very little room for any bias to be interpreted. And some of this has to do with Burgess and his weird fascination with Hegel, which is actually a misreading of Hegel, but we'll bracket that. We don't need to talk about Hegel right now. So what results from Dunning's graduate studies with Burgess is that he then goes to Columbia University, becomes faculty there, and essentially becomes a hub and really a safe haven for Southern students who were interested in doing doctoral research on Reconstruction. So in a similar fashion that Dunning becomes this figurehead for this white supremacist understanding of Reconstruction, we also have, Donald Trump in a very similar position for poor white Americans. Neither of them have the background or understanding of the people that are following them. And in fact, Dunning was born in New Jersey to a middle-class family. So he's not Southern. He had, as far as I know, had very little travel to the South, if any. Yet somehow he becomes the thesis advisor for several students whose dissertations later became the basis for a vast amount of historical claims in United States textbooks dictating the history of Reconstruction. Now, this is going to be important for many reasons. One, for those of you who are sort of interested in publications, you probably notice that a lot of educational books are actually published in Texas. And there's a very interesting and complicated way in which those textbooks are composed, who's chosen to review them, and of course, the difference between the product that is sent in and then the final product that is given to children and other young adults to consume. So after Dunning has been teaching at Columbia for several years and amasses, this large cohort of students under his belt, they soon become known as the Dunning School. And what results are several different articles and publications from Dunning, most notably an essay or a book with a collection of essays titled Essays on Reconstruction. So Dunning is looking at Reconstruction in that text from a historical perspective, a political perspective, and really there I would say political economy, because he's speaking a lot about the economical loss that Southerners endured as a result of emancipation, and contrary to what a lot of people say, we see this very proto-argument for reparations. Dunning in fact says that Southerners are morally and politically required to receive recompense for the slaves that were freed from under them. And then we also see several comments about what was to become the Regention era. So part of why Dunning is going to be very important is because Du Bois is not just interacting with Dunning as a figure. He actually does meet Dunning in person at the 1909 American Historical Society or American Historical Association meeting, either 1909 or 1910. And he's actually on a panel with Dunning, and the topic is Reconstruction. And so Du Bois delivers an early version of a paper that's published titled Reconstruction and its benefits. But Dunning had actually remarked that he had never met a formidable Negro until he met Du Bois. So you can take that as you will. Now, what happens before this meeting, of course, is recalling that Du Bois is not just, again, meeting Dunning as, a contemporary, but he's growing up with this account of Reconstruction. He's growing up with this idea that not only was Reconstruction a failure, but it was a failure because the South had been unfairly mistreated, and two, the large amount of Black officials that had been let into the Senate and the House by the radical Republicans were swarthy, they were gluttonous, they stole money, et cetera, and that and other small reasons led to the failure of Reconstruction. And this very poisonous mentality within Northerners that the South and Southerners were rebellious and they were never going to fully unite the nation again. So with that in mind, what I am doing in the second portion of the project is really tracing how similar sentiments are actually within our current era, particularly within those on the alt-right and those who are following on, the Trump train, right? This idea that there has been some great wrong done to a particular group of people. And what's interesting about Trumpism is that it's not just located within the South. So even in here, Massachusetts and New Hampshire, where I live, you see a large amount of poor white Americans who are following this individual who has never been poor in his life, admittedly made his fortune off of a small loan of $1 million from his father, went to an Ivy League school, has had vast amounts of success and wealth his entire life, and suddenly finds himself at the forefront of the Republican Party because, by his own admittance, this is the easiest party to integrate in terms of, basically manipulating people. And there are several different articles that discuss this, and if folks would like to read them, feel free to let me know and I can send them to you. So in a very similar way that we see Trump emerge as his demagogue, we also see a very similar emergence and statue of William Dunning. And so with that, what I want to now turn to is the second part, where we're looking at historical context. So the reason why I want to emphasize historical context is because it's very common for individuals to claim that some sort of phenomenon or the event is the first of its kind, or we use a lot of hyperbolic language to describe the event. But I think it's very important to pay attention to what's occurring in history and looking at it as a blueprint, as opposed to just random constellations of events. And if we look at it this way, we actually find that none of this is really new, right? The manifestation may be slightly different, right? We're in a different time period, and also social media makes things a lot more efficient in terms of being spread and espoused. But when we think about the context in which these certain sentiments have come about, it's not quite the case that they're new. So in Dunning's text, Essays on Reconstruction, Civil War Reconstruction, he actually documents and dictates several ways in which the police state and the KKK had united in order to suppress the Black vote, in a very similar way that we see this happening today in the South with cases such as Georgia, where individuals were actually actively at the polls preventing Black Americans from voting, and also in more subvert ways where we have voting ID laws that will predominantly affect a majority of the population where they are quite older. For example, my grandmother, who is turning 84 this June, right? She doesn't have a birth certificate. She was born in North Carolina. She was a sharecropper, same as my grandfather. And so in this way, voting ID laws actively prohibited her from being able to vote for a large period of time. So when we're thinking about how to respond to, when we're thinking about how to respond to white supremacy, and in particular, the white supremacist nature of the alt-right, and now it's no longer just Donald Trump, now we have Ron DeSantis, we have, what is his name, something Santos?
Oh,
George Santos, but I mean, I think he's in his own world now. I don't really know what he's doing at the moment. You have Governor Abbott in Texas. And so we have a large amount of individuals who are emerging under this banner of Trumpism, where it's not quite the case that Trump was really the catalyst for this. So when these individuals claim that they're part of a silent majority, we really want to pay attention to what is really being said behind that term. And for me, what I'm taking this to mean is that by a silent majority, this position and those who are becoming active in this alt-right group or in its various subgroups now have always existed. Trump just essentially gave a platform and made it acceptable in some ways to just be vocal and open about it. So in a similar way that we see Trump creating a formal structure where we can now associate these views, a similar framework is being created under Dunning, who along with his students has helped shape the social imagination and the ways that we are even currently understanding the Civil War and the afterlife of slavery, as folks like Saidiya Hartman term it. So how that's going to connect to our current framework, we can see this in a couple of ways. And one way is that, interestingly enough, again, when we look at textbooks in the United States, and particularly textbooks in public schools, because private schools are very closed, it's very hard to actually get a read on what those districts are looking at, and it also depends, of course, if it's a Catholic private school, for example, are they following the archdiocese, or is it a charter school or any other sort of subdivision there. But with public schools, a large majority of the books, and this was even the case in the late 40s when Du Bois was doing a survey on textbooks in the United States, the predominant narrative still existed that Reconstruction had failed because there was some sort of fault on the part of Black Americans. Or it states, maybe a little bit more softly, that Reconstruction failed because the North was not able to fully reconcile with the South. And of course, the point of tension here prohibiting this reconciliation is the question of slavery. Now, what Du Bois reveals throughout Reconstruction, or Black Reconstruction rather, is that it's a lot more complicated than just slavery. So what happens in his research is that he discovers there's a Southern oligarchy called the planters, and they are the small amount of white Americans that own slaves. So when whites often say, you know, I'm not racist, my family didn't own slaves, they're technically correct. However, what Du Bois is going to follow that is that the poor whites actually are the individuals that were the overseers. They were the slave catchers. Because they were not able to own slaves, they became immensely jealous of the Southern oligarchy, not just because they had vast amounts of wealth and slaves, but they had a large portion of political power and influence. And so this, the Southern oligarchy becomes crucial when it comes to understanding the tensions between poor Blacks and enslaved Blacks, and then poor and working class whites. So the Southern oligarchy and the Northern oligarchy that he associates with this industrial, the push towards industrialization in factories, we see these two groups essentially pitting the working class whites and Blacks against each other by saying that because white Americans were not efficient enough in their work, we're going to either hire Black Americans at lower wages, of course lower than any living wage, or in the South, we'll just have slaves do the work, because you can't fire a slave. You don't have to pay the slave, obviously. And the third underlying effect of that is now we have created seeds of racial tension in the social minds of white Americans, which has festered and grown into various claims about Black Americans, such as the superhuman belief, the idea that Black Americans are just naturally better at certain agricultural work, and also the idea that the reason why these individuals are enslaved or in very poor conditions is because that's just their natural place. So all of these racialized ideas are becoming embedded within the social and economic tensions that are fueling what then results in the Civil War. So it is correct that the Civil War was not just about slavery, but right, that's not the full picture. And we really need the historical context there in order to understand why it is that discussing race in the Civil War is not just uncomfortable for many white Americans, but also points to a very particular pattern that occurs in history of pitting these groups together. So if we think about the ways in which the rhetoric of poor whites especially, right, this idea that, for example, immigrants and migrants from Latin and Central America are taking jobs, this idea that Black women are welfare queens and too many Black people on welfare, they're not working, all of these various stereotypes are rooted in this fear that any sort of aid or protection is being absorbed by minorities, they're putting white Americans out of work, all rooted in what's also called the Great Replacement Theory. This idea that white Americans are going to be replaced, not just physically with the intermixing of races, but also in an economic sense. We no longer need them as laborers because we have these others who will be able to do the labor at a lower cost. Again, not because it's ethically sound, but because they are in such a position where they're having to take whatever work that they can in order to survive. So what's interesting about this logic here, of course I'm calling it logic in square quotes because it's not really logical. You really can't fight this with empirical data. And for those of you that have tried to sway any individuals who may be somewhere in this alt-right, QAnon, whatever world, they quickly have a rebuttal for any sort of retort that you give regarding their political beliefs. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Psychologically, there's something called the backfire effect, where no matter what evidence you present, it just makes people more rooted within their beliefs. There is also, of course, the fact that for many of these individuals, the truth is pretty much really what's on Fox News or Breitbart or any other conservative media source, because they have been told for so long that any other source is not telling the truth and people are being lied to. And so in some ways, providing empirical data doesn't really help convince these groups of people about the mistruths that they're not only absorbing for themselves, but they're also passing down to others throughout generation and generation. So it really shouldn't be a surprise that poor white Americans voted and elected Trump and almost did a second time, because historically this group of individuals have almost always voted against their interests, because in their mindset, they're not competing against elite white capitalists, they're competing against minority groups, particularly historically Black Americans, and then this expands as not just immigration increases, but also as a concept of race changes as well. So one way that we can see this is historically, those from Mexico and even from Cuba were actually classified as white. And it isn't until a bit later that we see some of these classifications changing. So I believe, because I'm not a historian, remember, but I believe the classification of Hispanic came from the Nixon administration. So that was for a very specific purpose in order to, again, try and control voting districts and try and, articulate, well, who's white-ish but not quite white, and who's, dark and black-like, but we don't want to call them black because then that will give black citizens in this era too much of a voting power, so on and so forth. So just as we look at, redlining and gerrymandering, we also want to pay attention to the census as well, because that's going to help us understand this occurrence too. So, interesting. Okay, I'm sorry, I just noticed that. The title is right, but the content's not. So, essentially what I had there was, again, this discussion of this white backlash. So what does it mean for something to be a whitelash? This idea that because we had the first black president, white people are now upset that the white supremacist imagination has been disrupted because now we have this spot of color amongst many, many, many white individuals who have been president in this country. But also, again, simultaneously, debates around whether or not he's even black enough. So some of you, of course, will remember the birth certificate arguments because for some reason people don't consider Hawaii a state. We also have the argument about his ancestry, so Kenyan father, white mother. Well, I mean, is he really black because he's mixed and he doesn't talk to his father, and what is that about? And other arguments, again, where the logic is not logical because it's not, again, rooted in any concrete argument, but it's rooted in this fear of the other, this fear of being replaced. And if we trace this argument back through history, we really see most of its inception during Reconstruction and in the early parts of the Civil War, because the Southern oligarchs are trying to find any way, not just to keep the institution of slavery, but they want to oppose the Northern industrial elites. So the main way to do that was, of course, to turn the working class groups against each other and to have working class whites oppose abolition, because that would mean that the South not only keeps the institution of slavery, but they maximize their profits because they have free labor and then very, very cheap labor, either from the low amount of working class whites who were working for some of these elites and then the large amounts of poor blacks. And we see this again passed on into sharecropping after the elimination of the institution of slavery, and in several other ways, chain link gangs, the ways that prisoners have been rented for labor and still are rented, especially in California, and so on and so forth. So in conclusion, what I think that this issue spells out for many of us, whether we live in the United States or not, is this general fear of a black consciousness, the fear of any sort of literature or general idea taking place and rooting itself in the popular imagination, that black individuals are not only agential subjects, but that they actually have their own views. And within that is a fear that Bell Hooks discusses in an essay titled Whiteness in the Black Imagination. And so in that essay, she speaks about how white individuals are often very surprised and shocked to read the accounts of racism experienced by Black Americans, but even more shocked that they're actually painted as villains in the Black imagination. And so we see this disconnect between whiteness, which in the United States has primarily been posited as this really pinnacle of morality, right? Even historically in the United States, one of the ways in which one was deemed a citizen was an evaluation of good, white, moral character. That was a legal definition of a citizen in the United States. So when this imagination is disrupted or it's challenged in any way, this is how we see this whitewash. It's not through Donald Trump, it's not through DeSantis, but a very deep psychological and political fear within the white consciousness. And this is something that will predate Trump, and it will continue long after Trump, loses his popularity, which will happen, right? Even if at the moment we think it won't, but in many ways it already is. DeSantis has largely taken over the role of Trump within the Republican Party. And we see this in the ways that he's actually being prepped right now to potentially become the candidate. Now, that's not going to prevent other people from running, but what's becoming interesting is that we now see almost a contest as to who can fulfill the position of demagogue in the white imagination the best, now that Trump has failed to do so. So with that, I just want to end with a quote from Du Bois and really have all of us consider not just, what he means by propaganda of history, but what does it really mean to be a historian? And all of us are historians. It doesn't matter if you have a degree or not, or if you're in a field that studies archival work. Oral history is history. Everyone in this room right now, right, you're part of a historical moment, and we have to really think critically about what ethical decisions we're making when we are telling others about the history that's happening not only in this country, but even historical events that are occurring in other countries that the United States is a part of. So that is the end of my talk, and I look forward to any discussion we might have. And that's my contact information if you'd like to send me an email.
Let's open it up for questions. We're very informal here. Does anyone have a question? Yes, please.
You mentioned that the South was kind of creating a blueprint. Did you find evidence of a discourse around the future? To that regard, I'm just curious, whether there was a kind of an expression of wanting to preserve for the future generation, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you read Dunning's text, he actually has a couple of interesting citations where he's looking at different letters that have been exchanged from Civil War generals and even other political leaders within the South. And what seemed to be the dominant understanding when I dug a bit further is that, one of the reasons why we even see Confederate memorials in the South is because of a desire to hold on to a history. Now, it's interesting because, of course, I'm blanking on his name. Who was the president? Davis. So on his deathbed, actually, he requested that no one make memorials of him or other Confederate generals because he did not want the Civil War to be memorialized in such a manner. And towards the end of his life, he actually deemed it as shameful.
Is that Davis or Lee?
Well, Lee was the general, I think, but Davis was the president of the Confederacy.
I think it was Davis.
Yeah.
Now, there are statues of Lee, too. Lee was
He was the general.
He was a
But
general.
he had a similar quote.
Yeah, he didn't like the memorialization either. He didn't have much choice
Oh, wow.
than building those statues of them.
Yeah. Okay, so now we see this is more than one person espousing this. But of course, what do we see in the contemporary period? Fights over whether or not to rename bridges, schools, residence halls, and that's even on Dartmouth campus as well, actually. So they are thinking about the future, and they are thinking about ways that they can ensure not just that the story is told from a particular perspective, but how can we ensure that those who come after us, again, children, is a very weird, predatory way that children are often spoken of in these contexts. How can we ensure that children are taught the right history so that they can become the next generation of people who are going to strengthen this white supremacy framework and imagination?
So Bailey, by you saying and being reiterated about Lee and Davis not wanting these memorials, it just seems like, are you sure? It's almost as if it's questionable because it just seems so out of, so why are there so many, like the shift was obvious, the propaganda was real, the shift was real to, I use this word purposely, erect statues. Because it's so, it's surprising and it shouldn't be. But the lore we understand is that, or, me going to school in the South will rise again. And so it's, the war of northern aggression, it's this idea behind, we are misunderstood. We were the victims, not, what's the word, traitors.
Yeah, and I think one reason why this mentality has really prevailed for so long is because many people really didn't have access to these archival materials. But now that it's 2023 and everything's digitized and people are able to share something so quickly, whether it's a speech or even something from the archive collection upstairs, there are folks who are beginning to really question this history and also even the accuracy of many books. So there have been several books that have actually been pulled because they still cited the dissertations from Dunning students, even after we have this period where historians and political scientists finally acknowledge that he is a racist, and Columbia University even has a whole web page dedicated to talking about Dunning, the Dunning School, and the impact that he had, not just at Columbia, but in the larger social imagination. I am.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
Picking up on Davis is that in Shelby Foote's third volume of his last report's kind of history of the Civil War, the last line he has Jefferson Davis say something like, on his deathbed, "I've always believed in the United States." I just Googled it. Apparently he said, "No more medicine, I can't take it," because they were drugging him up too much. So I don't know where Shelby Foote got that from, but the reason I use that as sort of segue is partly to build on this idea that what Davis was really, and a lot of other Confederate leadership were really doing is trying to put themselves in an American story. And then there was a sort of splintering from that with Jubal Early and other Confederate generals who sort of went the more southern and white nationalist direction. My real question though is, this quote comes in the concluding volume of a 1,000,000-word look at the Civil War from a lost cause point of view. And yet, one of the first things that we all say, myself, you, all of us, about Black Reconstruction is, oh, it's so long. It's shorter than this third volume book about the Civil War, which comes on top of maybe 10, 15,000 books that have been published since the end of the Civil War about the conflict itself at that end in 1865. So my question is kind of twofold. Why do we sort of recoil from a book, any book, but especially a book of this length about Reconstruction? And why did Du Bois go into so much detail? Why was he so forensic in the text? Why did he include so much? Because he wanted to include even more.
Right, so Adam's alluding to a couple of discussions we've actually had about the history of Black Reconstruction. So Du Bois was contracted to write a 2-volume book on Reconstruction, what happens, the Great Depression, so now he has to greatly condense the book, and over 20,000 words were cut from the final manuscript. There are actually 2 large edits that were made before we get the final book, which was, I think, about $5, which is $92 in our currency today. So already there, right, great restriction on who's able to read this book. However, to address Adam's questions, I'll start with the last one, why Du Bois produced so much rigorous analysis in that text. One reason I think is that he actually meant for it to potentially become a textbook that might be used in universities and as a resource for educators. So if you manage to get your hands on Black Reconstruction, and I encourage you to at least just go to the library and look at the physical copy. He has a very snarky bibliography at the end where he sort of ranks different accounts of Reconstruction. You have the standard anti-Negro, propaganda, and then other categories in terms of the level of veracity that Du Bois is finding within the text. I also think that one of the reasons why Du Bois is sort of moving to that methodology is because in the archive you also see several letters where he had been formally criticized for not having enough information in his books. And so perhaps maybe he's going overboard and now providing all the citations. And of course, again, criticism for Reconstruction is that it's way too much like a thesis. So you really can't win at the end of the day. But I think when it comes to looking at Du Bois's motivation for this text, part of what I'm finding in the archive is that at the same time, again, he's doing that and analysis of textbooks in the United States. So it seems to me like there was some desire for this text to become institutionalized in some sense. Now, I'm slightly forgetting the first question.
I guess more sort of teasing out this idea of why Reconstruction is so
Why
such
people
a
go
subject
away
of horror for so many people, and yet the war itself is seen with such interest.
That's something that I'm actually considering myself. So I went to private school, and we didn't learn about Reconstruction. I mean, I think I maybe had a paragraph. Of course, I have a mother at the same time. Every time I come home, I have to do separate homework. So I had separate books, I had to do reports and things like that. So I always had that alternative, education, but I know many of my peers didn't. In terms of, I think, why children aren't taught it, it's because there's an argument that it's, too complicated for them to understand. In other cases, when it comes to Black Reconstruction, why people, recoil from, the magnitude of the text. I'm going to be honest and say that I do believe that the writing in Black Reconstruction is a bit hard to understand if you don't have a certain level of education, because the writing is not made for the popular audience, despite the publisher being one where Du Bois had previously published a couple of plays, I think Dark Princess. Other than that, I'm not really sure why people recoil from it. I think it's one of the more exciting parts of American history, but.
So are you talking about recoiling from studying Reconstruction or the physical book itself?
Both.
I just feel like the mythology of the failure of Reconstruction as opposed to the Civil War.
Yes, exactly.
Right, it's like a war. Win or lose, it's a war. I don't know.
And a
We
shame.
like war.
There's a lot of shameism around. I mean, white people shame around Reconstruction. They don't want to talk about it.
There is definitely a lot of shame, and that's one of the reasons why a large portion of the original AP African American Studies course was cut down. So Audre Lorde was taken out, Bell Hooks was taken out. I want to say even parts of Du Bois were also removed. So
you can't be queer or a Marxist to be in the AP African American. I'm sorry.
So, I mean, as an educator, right, there's a lot of pressure placed upon us when it comes to, how do students react to the material that we teach? Is it okay for students to feel guilt? I think there's a difference between guilt and shame, but, without going into that, I think the fact of the matter is history makes people uncomfortable, and I think it should. The same way knowledge is not made to make everyone feel comfortable. I don't believe that there's any form of pure objectivity with knowledge, but as someone who is a social epistemologist, one of the ways that I do think knowledge becomes suppressed is very much tied to certain affective responses that people have to various epistemic claims. So while white Americans will try to hide behind the claim that they didn't own slaves, their family was too poor, well, that doesn't mean that you're still not part of the large group of poor Americans who terrorized African Americans and also became part of, overseers, slave catchers, and of course, having that led to the modern police state.
I have a question.
Oh no, I was fixing my glasses.
Oh. I really think it's so interesting, your philosophy and Bois. So, was it hard in the philosophy department when you were going through your studies to bring, or was it well accepted to talk about Du Bois as your center?
So Du Bois actually wasn't in my dissertation, so that made it a lot easier.
Oh, yeah.
Although, of course, I had plenty of pushback on that, even without him being there. But Du Bois is regarded as a philosopher in the sense that he's a core figure in critical philosophy of race. So folks primarily look at his 1897 essay, Conservation of Races, where he gives his definition of race and speaks about the ways in which the notion of race is important and useful in terms of preserving it. And he's regarded as one of the early scholars who falls under this field of racial constructionism. So this idea that race is a social construction, et cetera, et cetera. Outside of those areas, and of course looking at souls of Black folk, it gets a little iffy. So if you do critical theory and you look at his Marxism, you're fine. But it definitely would not be appropriate for, in some cases, to call him a philosopher proper, right? He can be a philosopher in the sense that we're all philosophers, but whether or not he is an actual philosopher.
Is he taught in undergraduate?
He studied philosophy at Fisk.
Oh.
And he worked under William James, who was a philosopher. He had a great pragmatist. And when he went to Germany, for those 2 years that he was there, he studied Hegel quite extensively.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, if there are no more questions, we're gonna thank
Yes.
Bailey one more time.